Ramones perfected rock and roll in the mid-1970s. This makes perfect sense because as baby boomers, the original four members grew up with rock and roll. That is to say that the music genre itself was born and matured right along with them from the 1950s through the 1960s. By the time the four guys from Queens started a band and adopted the same last name, rock music had radiated out into several sounds and subgenres, some keeping the same spirit of the early days alive, but plenty of the rest evolving into something unrecognizable to the original rock and roll sound. Monte A Melnick, sometimes referred to as the Fifth Ramone, was with the band for the entire 22 years trotting all over the globe. In 2003, he released a book called On the Road with the Ramones, which chronicles the period from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s through quotes and anecdotes of those who were there. He joined me for a conversation on the EPS Podcast to dissect the band, as well as his book, as primary sources of their respective periods. All right. Welcome to Season 2 of the EPS Podcast, where everything's a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I've made it no secret over the last season or so, after doing a few episodes involving or revolving around the Ramones, just what a huge fan of that group I am. They mean everything to me. I've throughout my entire, since discovering them, just every song, everything that the band ever did has some place in my life in some way or another. I don't know if there's a better way of conveying that or not. So it's just a remarkable thrill. It's probably the biggest deal ever to have on my show today Monte A Melnick, who was for the entire career of the band right there, right? I mean, you were there as their tour manager, but even more from even before the band really came together, right? You were friendly with them.
Yeah, I grew up with Tommy Ramone and the guys in Forest Hills, Queens. And
so we're gonna talk about your book. We're gonna talk about your book today, which is on the road with the Ramones. And I've had this for years, but you've had a couple editions come out, right?
Yeah, I have a new, about a year and a half ago, a bonus edition. I added 40 more pages to the book there. I see you got the hard copy of the book there. That's nice. Yeah.
So I actually, I don't remember. I think I got it as a gift. And like, for me, it's like the easiest thing in the world to give me a gift, because it's like, okay, anything with the Ramones on it, Eric will like it, you know? And so I think my brother may have picked this up for me somewhere, and it may have been, I don't know, the British American version, because throughout it, like every time it mentions anything, dollars, it says pounds next to it or something to clarify for the British audience. I don't know, but it's a really great book because it's written in a way different than most books of its kind. I like how it patterns. It'll just have like a paragraph or so from each of the people involved, and then move on to somebody else. But it tells the whole story from beginning to end through like clips of interviews. Is that essentially how you made it?
Well, yeah, it's oral history too, with my talking in between there, and my co-author Frank Meyer does a great job writing my stories in there. But it's an oral history, right? I interview a lot of people involved with the band. Yeah.
So, the first question, and for those of you just joining the show who've never listened to an episode before, the way I operate this podcast is I basically treat everything as a primary source. It needs to be analyzed. I have a series of questions that we analyze, and the answers to those questions result in telling us something about the time period in which it was made. This book, and then therefore by extension the band, because without the band there'd be no book. So the first question is, what materials is made from, and how is it made? Would you say from the beginning, like around what year did you recognize that the Ramones were something unique and that you were going to have great memories when all was said and done?
Well, they're unique from the very beginning. I saw them in the performance studios, where Tommy brought them in as a three-piece group. Joey was on drums, and Dee Dee singing and playing bass, and Johnny on guitars. Tommy wasn't in the group at the time. He just wanted to do some management. But they were always very unique at the time. I came from a different perspective. I was in groups before. I was in groups with Tommy before the Ramones, and I actually had a group I was in called 30 Days Out. I had 2 albums on Warner Brother Reprise, 1971-72, and we toured with the Beach Boys and the Quicksilver Messenger Service and other groups like that. So I saw the Ramones from a different aspect when I first saw them. As they were very raw. I actually didn't like them in the beginning because I was coming from a group that we could sing and play guitars, and the Ramones were just learning their instruments. They were very, very raw, and they were coming from a totally different aspect of music than I was used to. So it took me a little while. I started working with them doing sound, and little by little they worked up their whole musical experience and stage presence, and I got to like them better and better as I was working with them.
Where did at what point did they ask you to manage their touring, or like how did that come about?
Well, yeah, initially, as I said, we were working with Tommy in this performance studios, rehearsal recording studio, and he had the Ramones do showcases there, and I was running the sound for them at the showcases. And then they said, well, you got a job here and there outside. And they said, come along and start running the sound. So I started doing the sound for them outside performance studios. Performance studios had to close down. The neighbors shut us down, unfortunately. And they started getting a lot of jobs outside, especially at CBGB's, where they played more than 60, 70 times.
Wow.
And there I went along with them, started doing the sound and helping them with the equipment early on, and doing a little driving. So I kind of worked my way up from the bottom up. With the group there, learning all the aspects of road work and stuff like that. So when they started getting a lot of jobs outside of New York, I just took off with them and worked my way up from just a roadie. The bigger they got, the more people they could hire. So I worked my way up to road manager and to tour manager finally. I mean, it must have been a blur in some ways, when 96 rolls around and they played their last show. From at what point after August of 1996 to when you published this book, how long did it take you before you're like, yeah, I really should get around to printing that? Well, after Ramones retired, I worked with several other groups, Degeneration, Ronnie Spector, and a few other groups. People always coming to me and say, why don't you write a book? I said, well, I'm not really a writer, And I wasn't comfortable with some of the things I had to say about Joey and the other guys. So when Joey passed away, I felt a little better. I could really write the book. And the company that did Joey's solo album, Sanctuary Music, also had a publishing company. And I went into them and said, I'm not really a writer, but they got me a ghostwriter. But the ghostwriter was so good, a guy named Frank Meyer. He was really into the Ramones. He was a journalist. He was a musician, street walking cheetahs. Did such a great job, they gave him co-writing. So at the time when Joey passed away, I felt I could really put it all into the book at that time.
It seems like the group has had a few different rebirths. While they were around, they got renewed a few times by having new members added. CJ especially really seemed to bring some. It was like one of the fans became a part of the band when he joined. And then after they ended, I remember right around 2000 or so, and then definitely after when in 2001 or 2 when Joey passed on, it seemed to be a renewed interest, and a lot of people are like, how did I not know about these guys? Like a younger generation was getting into them. I started seeing a lot more Ramones shirts being worn around, and stores selling them that never even had them. Nobody knew them outside of the hey ho, let's go chant at a baseball game. Do you think do you think there's a reason why they were rediscovered around the same time this book first came out?
It's funny that they're on jock rock albums now.
Right.
Which they never expected to have that. They wanted a chant in the song. That's why I wrote this song, Hey Ho, Let's Go. You know what happened? When I thought, well, now they're bigger than ever. People say Stones, Ramones, Beatles in one sentence. It's like amazing how big they are. I feel that early on, they were kids that didn't have any influence, and they grew up into positions where they could put Ramones music into like soundtracks, all of a sudden commercials, all of a sudden, the kids grew up listening to the Ramones, loving them, and then they finally got a chance to do a lot for the Ramones that the Ramones couldn't get early on in their career, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that's how they got bigger and bigger, because all these kids then now grew up, and we're getting them on all these things. As I said, commercials, movie soundtracks, and stuff like that. That's how I feel like got bigger and bigger, and people finally the radio started playing them, more in the States. They couldn't get a lot of radio play when they were around here in the States. Yeah. So now all of a sudden the kids grew up and they were into the position where they're DJs on radio stations and played them a lot more, and they can be a lot bigger. That's how
when I was in college, I had a radio show, and I made sure to play the Ramones all the time. Probably more than I was allowed to. But
college radio was always played the Ramones, but the mainstream radio really ignored them for all those years. They couldn't get the hits. That's why they kept on they changed their producers all the time. Different, maybe the Graham Gouman or Bill Spector or blah blah blah. Maybe one of them could produce the Ramones and we'll get a hit on the radio finally.
It's and that's, I think one of the things about the group is that they so I did an episode last season about end of the century, and a friend of mine who did the episode with me put it so well. He's like, they're almost like they're from a time that never existed. Like they were just like the perfect combination of the 50s and 60s, and they arrived in the 70s, but it wasn't really the 70s that most people think of. It's not until recent times that we see the 70s with the Ramones in it. I think for most of the 80s and 90s, 70s nostalgia included just like disco, bell bottoms, the Brady Bunch, stuff like that. And it wasn't until, like you said, when people who had the ability to kind of pay homage to them referred back to them. But you think of like End of the Century, which was made in the end of the 70s. It is almost like they were going intentionally backwards to the 60s with that album, and instead of leaping forward to the 80s. It was almost like a different dimension, like a different time that didn't quite exist yet.
By the way, that people ask me what my favorite Ramones song is. I like a lot of different Ramones songs, but my favorite Ramones song is on that album. Do you have any idea which song that is on End of the Century?
Would it be Danny Says?
No, that's about Danny Fields.
Right, but I know All the Way. Joey mentions you in that, right?
Yeah, that's it. He wrote me into the song. Monty's driving me crazy. It's like being in. It's not the honor of being in a Ramones song, which I always liked.
Was that something that you appreciated at the time, or was it afterward?
No, at the time it was nice. Even though I'm driving him crazy, which I was basically, trying to get him around, but that's what he viewed it. He also talks about other things: the band's driving him crazy, the monitorment's driving him crazy. There's a sentence in there that the bubble's going to explode. I'm never going to grow old. That's a sad fact he wrote into that song there.
Yeah, that one is actually probably my favorite album. Well, Leave Home, I think, is my favorite, but I remember just listening to End of the Century over and over again when I was a teenager. The sound quality of it, like something about it just made each of those songs seem very, I don't know, melancholy in a way. It didn't sound like their other albums. So it was always, it stood out to me for that reason, but I always liked that song a lot.
Phil Spector production there.
Yeah. The wall of sound.
He added that to it.
So, with the resurgence of their, I don't know, fame or anything like that. It seems also like the facts about the group kind of have gotten thrown away. Like I remember a couple years ago, Rolling Stone had a cover article. They were on the cover and it's like the true story of the Ramones. And I remember reading it. I was like, this is like somebody just went to Wikipedia and pulled the information off of there. And there was a commercial probably about 15 years ago for Cadillac. And it had all these, it's like good things come from garages. And they showed like Apple Computers was started in a garage, and you hear, and the whole time they're playing they're playing do you remember Rock and Roll Radio for the commercial? And they're like, and the Ramones started in a garage. I'm like, I don't think they did. Like,
no, that's grunge rock. And
yeah,
like they didn't start in a garage.
They started.
Yeah, I still remember that.
Like you said, in performance studios and
right. CBGBs and all that.
And didn't they sometimes rehearse in Joey's mom's basement?
Yeah, basement. Yeah, Joey's mother had an art gallery in the basement. They first started off down there.
So I feel like it's another very important thing about this book is that it sets the record straight, because there's nobody else that had the experience that you did, that you were, to use the term for my podcast, the primary source. Like for all those shows, you like, where was Monte A Melnick during every single one of those concerts? Were you like in the wings, backstage?
It depends on what year you're talking.
Yeah.
In the early years, I was working the sound for them.
Yeah.
I did the sound for them in the early years, till they got enough money to hire a professional sound company. And the more people they could hire, drum roadies, guitar roadies, come along. I was setting up equipment, driving, and everything. Later on, I was, I had to do everything that a road manager, tour manager did. Usually when I put them on stage, I'd probably just, watch, make sure everything's okay with the barrier and everything's going on with the crowd and everything. I'd go talk to either the venue, the promoter, or the club owner or something, start settling up and, getting paid and stuff like that. So it's because the band didn't like to hang around very much. So I'd like to get that done earlier while they were on, so they can get out of there quickly,
They were no nonsense with that, right?
Yeah, they didn't like to hang around.
I was reading that section about the barrier. It seems, were the Ramones pretty much responsible for venues having the big barrier? Because it seemed like, at least early on, a lot of places didn't, right? Like a lot of
clubs usually didn't have any barriers. Johnny didn't like anybody on stage. It's our show. Let's not have anybody jump on stage. They hated people stage diving and jumping on stage. Yeah. So I'd have to ask for barriers, basically. A lot bigger festivals always had barriers,
right,
to keep people away. But basically, clubs never had any. I always brought in barriers to a lot of clubs just to make sure that we could have that separation.
And it wasn't so much because I see that as not like egotistical or anything like that, but more like I think I've heard Johnny say before in interviews and stuff, like, you came to see the band, we're going to give you the show exactly what you deserve, and we don't want anybody interrupting it or messing with it. Like, he was pretty adamant about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. He said that. It's our show. I don't want anybody jumping on stage. It's a distraction, basically. I mean, I know kids had fun jumping on stage and diving into the audience a lot, but he says, this is the show. This is what we do. I don't want anybody getting on stage. So that's why we had good security and barriers.
So, I mean, I could not have gotten, I wrote this in my email to you, I couldn't have gotten into them at a worse time, because like when I was a teenager, I got really into Aerosmith. I liked Aerosmith a lot. I liked U2 and a couple other groups, but I remember watching the MTV Movie Awards when they did that, and it was they did the whole all the songs up for best song and like John Lovitz introduced them, and I remember like I was watching it, and it's kind of like half watching it, and they had, before they came on, they showed the band backstage walking around. I'm like, man, those guys, they look kind of familiar. Like, they look like something my parents are, like, my mom's from Mount Vernon, New York, so just outside the city, and they're of that generation too. Like, she saw the Beatles at Shea Stadium and in the 60s, and I'm like, this looks like a band that my parents are into. Like, they all look like Roy Orbison or something. And then when they started, I'm like, this is incredible. I'm like, this is so great. Like, 4 minutes, and they just flew through 10 songs.
Yeah, they plowed through that.
And then so I was like so interested. And then later that week they played the video for I Want to Be Sedated, and I'm like, oh, this is great. And I bought the CD of all that stuff, and no, not all that stuff anymore. The compilation one with the yellow cover, and I remember it has like a collage. Yeah, and it has Ramones Mania.
Yeah,
it has
Ramones
a collage
Mania
on it that says punk concert on it, and I was like, punk, because I'd always thought punk was mohawks and spiky hair and boots and everything like that. I'm like, these guys didn't look like what I thought a punk rocker was, but they really were. They started that. I mean, it wasn't like they defined the sound, if nothing else. And
yeah, you're thinking of the English punk rockers,
right?
That got and then they came to the States with spiky hair and all that. But the Ramones, they initially didn't like being called punk rock, basically,
Because didn't they see some of their competition
they
as
went
like
to England.
Aerosmith and stuff, right? Like they saw themselves as a hard rock group that just
rock and roll. They just basically rock and roll, but they didn't like being called punk. But they started it all out, basically, because the way they played fast, loud, short songs, no solos and drum solos and guitar solos. That was basically how punk took off that genre of music, that style that they started. And then they went to England, and then they took off with the safety pins and the spiky hairs and the crazy.
Yeah,
took off in a different direction there.
I've been watching that miniseries Pistol on Hulu about the Sex Pistols, and they kind of mentioned the Ramones a little bit in it, not as much as I think they deserve to be mentioned, but it shows kind of how they were sort of independently developing around the same time. But considering, the distance between, on other sides of the ocean, the Ramones sound, the look, everything like that, could that have happened anywhere else than New York? I mean, is that like the ultimate, like if it was, to me, the Ramones are New York in musical form. Like they are New York City. Do you think they would have sounded differently if they had formed in Buffalo or in Columbus, Ohio, or something like that?
Well, the Lower East Side at that time was a rough area. Bums and junkies and Salvation Army, and it wasn't a pleasant area, and that kind of formed the whole musical scene down there. The rough musical scene down there.
Yeah.
So that all influenced it. Yeah, I would say New York influenced it heavily. I wouldn't know what it would be like in Buffalo, but New York definitely, downtown Lower East Side had a lot to do with the whole scene down there.
I mean, that's my way of thinking too, is that it's quintessential in New York. Like if you were to, if you heard like fiddle music and guitars without any vocals, you're like, oh, it's from Tennessee. If you heard, surfer strains, you'd be like, oh, that's from Southern California. If you hear Johnny Ramone's guitar, you're like, that's New York. Like has the attitude. It has
I'd say
the stripped down, no nonsense. They can. I just thought it was so brilliant how they would play through so many songs at such a breakneck speed and not do the talking to the audience. And I interviewed Joe Queer of the Queers a few months ago, and I ended up naming that episode "The Apostle of Joey Ramone" because he was talking about how Joey, kind of like became his guide and explained to him like, you just gotta, like, the audience didn't come to hear you talk to them. They came to see you play. So here's, so they were professionals all the way through, right? Like they didn't mess around with distractions as much as other groups.
No, I mean, they worked on their stage presence and they'd rehearsed a lot. In fact, before every show, they'd have a little practice pad and a little amp and go into the dressing room and warm up and play a bunch of songs. Joey would take a little boombox, go into another room, do vocal exercise before every show. Before every show, they warmed up. They rehearsed a lot off the road. they worked on stage presence, what to do, where to come when they take the jackets off. The whole stage presence. It wasn't just, play 3 chords and that's it. They really worked on it very hard.
Did you advocate for that at all as tour manager, or was that something that just kind of came organically from the group?
No, that's the group, Johnny and first Tommy, and they all worked on it. They sat down together. I mean, if you see some early versions of the Ramones, the Ramones were transitioning from like glam rock period into what you call the punk rock period. So in the early years of the Ramones, they were, Johnny had like a leopard shirt, satin pants. They didn't know what to do, but they finally decided it was too expensive for those glam rock clothes, So they said, we'll just wear what we wear in the streets, which is our leather jackets and ripped pants, When I was young, when I ripped my pants, I put a patch in it.
Yeah.
Now it's like if you spend a lot of money on the ripped jeans, it's mind-boggling to me. You buy a pair of jeans for like $100 and it's ripped. It's a fashion now.
I see teenagers all the time wearing.
It took them a little gradually.
Yeah, I see kids wearing all the time like the jeans like that. I'm like, just make them shorts because like they're so huge. the rips are massive that you might as well just make them cutoffs. And I remember hearing Joey saying about that, how he's like, you had your favorite pair and you just wore them until they basically were shreds. Then he said he recognized
that's what they do.
Other people were doing it too. Like Bruce Springsteen started wearing jeans like that and, kind of adopting the look of the Ramones. And, he kind of saw it as so, going back to the book itself, one of the questions that comes up is what locations are associated with it? I mean, the name of the book is On the Road with the Ramones. Throughout touring with them, basically being kind of like their tour guide, where in the United States was probably the best place that they played, and where in the world was your favorite place to play?
Well, the States, they played over 2,263 shows, So they were basically a touring band because they couldn't sell any albums very many albums in their career, So they decided to tour a lot. So we'd get back to a lot of places over and over again. Mm-hmm. And then in the beginning, it was the bigger cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, the bigger cities that they were able to play. But little by little, they started playing all over. I think we only missed like 4 states in the whole United States we didn't play in. We played in every other United States, practically everywhere, But we managed to come back over and over again. That was a good thing about it, Small city like, say Cleveland or Columbus or something, we come back over and over again and develop it. That's how they developed their audiences. So basically they were a touring band, so we played everywhere. As far as where I liked, you're talking about 20 years, there's a lot of places I really liked to play. I like going to Japan a lot, basically, because that was so much different than everywhere else in the world, basically. People didn't look like it, they didn't talk like it, the food was totally different, the culture was different. So I really enjoyed going there. Australia was terrific. So a lot of places I like to go. That was my life for 20 years, just traveling all over the place. That's why I stuck with them, because they kept on going back and back and back. And they get, building a bigger audience each time. So it got a little better. And each time we went back to different cities,
That's incredible. And you couldn't have asked for a more dynamic group to be with, because it must have been just so much fun watching the audience react to them and respond to them, because you can't listen to the Ramones and not feel energized and happy. There's really no way about it to not feel good.
Well, the funny thing about that, in the early years, when I went to a small club, say like one time in Washington or Bremerton, Washington, or a small lumberjack club, and the kids are going crazy. They're jumping around, they're smashing around mosh pits and jumping. And the club owner or promoter comes to me, what's going on? There's a riot going on in the crowd. So no, that's the kids. They're having fun. They want. To me, I wouldn't get into those. You get hurt in those, developing like mosh pits. And, crowd surfing and all that stuff. The early years, the club owners didn't know what the hell was going on. They said, let's stop this. I said, no, that's the kids having fun.
That's what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, oh boy. So little by little, they realized that that's what the kids wanted to do. You know?
Mm-hmm. It's and I mean, I remember being at a concert in Philadelphia. It was a little club, and the headline band was Sloppy Seconds, who they did a great tribute to Joey after he died. And they were, there's a bunch of other punk groups ahead of them, but there was like all the different genres of punkers there, like every different kind of punk rocker. And in between bands, they have the house music playing, and it's just, the same old stuff. But then all of a sudden, I Want to Be Sedated came on. And it was like this moment of like, that's why we're all here. Even though the Ramones aren't playing here right now, or any of their members are with us right now, the reason that we're all in the room dressed the way that we are, about to dance or slam dance the way we're about to dance, is because of that group right now. And everybody here, no matter what edge of the punk spectrum they were on, has to pay homage to the Ramones, because if it hadn't been for them, the rest of it probably would not have taken shape. They were the integral part of all of that whole story.
That, by the way, that song Sedated just went platinum last year because of the pandemic. Everybody liked the song so much, and finally went platinum after all those years.
It's another.
I Want to Be Sedated.
Because and Joey wrote that about being on the road, right? Like he was just going crazy,
yes.
hotel room to hotel room, and just wanted to go home. And that song, right. It's happened in a number of other settings throughout my life. I've just been like a pub or a restaurant, and I hear it on the background, and there's people that, they don't look like they're into punk or anything. They just start tapping their toes or bobbing their heads like, yeah. I'm like, I know this music really should be on the radio a lot more often than it is. It's like, it should be on everywhere. It should, I think Henry Rollins put it well, is like, you could solve, world peace by just, blaring Ramones everywhere you go. Everybody would get along with it.
Yeah.
Just like so much other media in the tumultuous times of Watergate, soaring prices, energy shortages, and the end of the Vietnam War, the Ramones' music is steeped in nostalgia for the era following World War II. While the Ramones' sound was loud, angry, and raw, just like the time period from which the band was formed, you can still hear remnants of the bygone era that they clearly held in high regard. The book, On the Road with the Ramones, is a collection of primary sources from the period the band toured, but as such is a great document of the post-9/11 era. That was the age of Barnes & Nobles' and Borders and Amazons and online book exchanges. People like me who discovered the Ramones a little too late were constantly searching for more to learn about the band, whose sound and attitude is so timeless. Bypassing unofficial or unauthorized biographies that crowd the shelves, genuine accounts like this one met the demand of a curious micro-generation that was coming of age between the Gen Xers, who always had the Ramones, and the Millennials, who never did.
You were just in Germany.
Yeah.
Was that something related to this book or the Ramones in general?
Yeah. Well, the Ramones, there was an Electric City convention in Dusseldorf, and we took it up to Berlin, where there used to be a Ramones museum that shut down during the pandemic. So in Dusseldorf, they had a called Electric City, a musical convention, and they decided to concentrate on the Ramones this year, and they brought in John Holmstrom from Punk Magazine along with me, and George DeBose, the photographer. He also was my partner. George and I managed Marky after the Ramones retired in '96, and he actually lives in Germany, but he was there for the convention, and we did a little talk about the Ramones and Dusseldorf. Then we took it up to Berlin in a little small club up there.
Now, they've always been pretty big in Germany, and does that have a lot to do with Dee Dee's background?
Yeah, he grew up in Germany. He grew up in Berlin, It's in younger years. Yeah, definitely. And we always had a good promoter there, a guy named Skumak Skabatka. If you look on my Facebook, I put a picture of him up, and I managed to see him after all these years there. And we always played Germany quite a bit. Quite a bit. Funny story, I tell you, we always managed to. Just a funny story that we always managed to. First time we went to Germany was Thanksgiving, and the Germans didn't know what the catering company didn't understand what Thanksgiving was, so I had to explain to them. But every time we came back like 3 or 4 different times, and during the Thanksgiving period, so that finally the caterer finally got it right with the turkey and all that. It was kind of funny. We kept on coming back and during Thanksgiving,
That's funny. My brother he was studying in England one semester in college, and he went for Thanksgiving. The closest thing they could find was a Tex-Mex restaurant somewhere in London. And so a bunch of his fellow US classmates, and one of them brought along an English friend of theirs, and he was like on his cell phone, like, I'm in a Tex-Mex restaurant having Thanksgiving with a bunch of Americans right now. And and he's like, what do you guys do on Thanksgiving? They're like, eat and watch football. And he's like, oh, that's it? And like, yeah, pretty much. But it is a very uniquely American holiday. It's not really translates the same way other places. That's funny. So they finally got it right, and they provided all the trimmings.
Yeah,
when I was looking at your book, and it had all the writers, the things that they would want in the dressing room before and after the show and stuff like that. It didn't seem like, because you hear about some of the rock and roll rock stars, like, I want exactly 300 M&Ms, and they all have to be red, or they were never that particular, right? It was,
well, no, I didn't want, because we played a lot of small clubs in the beginning, and I didn't want to do too much because then just ignore the whole thing. You want this, forget about it. So I just kept it to the basics, and they mostly supplied everything we needed, but I didn't want to go overboard, because a lot of times in the early years, the club owners would just they throw it out, they throw the rider out, they wouldn't even look at it. There's a reason why there's famous about the M&Ms. The reason behind they don't know, like brown M&Ms and all that.
I've heard bits and pieces, no pun intended, but yeah, I don't really know the exact story.
Well, that's there because the group, I don't know, Van Halen or one of the groups, if they came into the dressing room and there was the M&Ms that had all the brown, that means that they weren't reading the rider.
Oh,
they did as a test, basically, not as being stupid. And I don't want brown M&Ms. They did that as a test to come in and say, oh, well, you read the rider. You actually did that. You know what I mean? I didn't do anything like that, but
yeah.
But
well, I mean, the kinds of things that were on there are so quintessentially American, just like the Thanksgiving feast. It's, the Ramones are really the most all-American band you could really dream up, right? I mean, Yoo-hoo, and
the Yoo-hoo thing is funny because outside the States, the foreign promoters would call me up and they say, what is this Yoo-hoo? What is? I said, don't worry, just get them some chocolate drink. It's okay. They were totally confused by the Yoo-hoo outside the United States. Even some places in the States, because it was like a local thing. I said, Yogi Berra here of the Yankees used to promote Yoo-hoo. I think it's famous. It was Nihi for Yoo-hoo or something. So kind of was like a local type of drink, but they understood it was a chocolate drink that the Ramones liked.
I started drinking it just because of the Ramones. I saw the pictures of Johnny Ramone with his Yoo-hoo shirt on, and the one that somebody made for him, and I was like, and I remember I would drink it. I'm like, oh, this is fantastic, so I'll just keep drinking it. But I got into it because of them, and it's just funny how these pop culture things just kind of swirl around and get to the group. Going back to Didi and his background with Germany, did that influence more than a few songs, right? I mean, it's in Today Your Love, Tomorrow the World, and
it's a long way back to Germany.
Yeah, and so I mean, would you say that had it not been for his inclusion in the band, they might not have had such a strong relationship with that country?
Well, maybe. I mean, they were bigger than other countries that none of the members were part of the earlier years. So but I for sure it helped a bit. And he spoke German. They liked that there, so it helped a bit in Germany. But as I said, we played so many different countries.
Yeah.
So
Well, I just remember when I heard about the Ramones Museum being in Berlin, I was like, why Berlin? I'm like, oh yeah, well, because Dee Dee has that connection.
Well, it was just that somebody in this guy Florian Haler had a huge collection of Ramones stuff, and he decided to open up a museum there. He collected a lot of stuff, so it should be here in New York, but it's so expensive to do anything here in New York. Nobody ever thought about it. Nobody here in New York had that massive collection he had, so he happened to be in Berlin. He's trying to open it up again because he had it closed during the pandemic.
There was some kind of exposition in Queens a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Wasn't there? I tried to get to it, but
that was a great show. You missed that.
I feel really.
Queens,
I was in Delaware, and we were about to head back to New Hampshire, and I just I saw it online. I'm like, oh, maybe we can stop by. I should have seen it, huh?
It was at Queens Museum, 2016. I think it was called The Birth of Punk. And we had a great museum there. Of course, I lived near there. I was working near there too. And I had 170 pieces from my private collection in there. And it was like 4 or 5 rooms of really, they did an intensive job. And I went to LA to the Grammy Museum, which is a little smaller. They had to cut down some of the rooms. It was supposed to travel like the Bowie exhibit, but the internal Ramones Corporation they were having problems, and they just didn't get around to doing that. And so they broke it up, and I got all my stuff back, and I put a lot of stuff on auction.
You're probably just bursting with Ramones memorabilia.
Well, I was because I put a lot into that show, and it's kind of like my pension. All those Ramones pieces that I sold.
Yeah. Is it kind of weird seeing stuff like that? Like when you were, especially maybe like around 1980 or so, the band had been going for a couple years. Did you ever think that these things will end up in a museum someday?
No, I mean, I just was lucky enough to stick them in a room that I kept them, and then they were just building up in another room in my house. At one point, I almost threw some stuff out. An old girlfriend of mine, she said, "You don't, I was going to throw stuff there. Don't, And I left it in there. And finally, with the museum show there, Queens Museum and all that, and they retired in 96 and they became so much bigger. All the little things that I had in the room, who knew, like a little tour pass or a itinerary or something like that, or a piece of clothing or whatever, that would be there was a lot of money behind that. I didn't know that. Luckily I saved it. Thank goodness, Because
I've been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they have a pretty substantial Ramones collection there. I think one of Johnny's guitars and a bass from Dee Dee, and it was really neat seeing that kind of stuff.
They had Johnny's guitar, which just so Danny Wright owned that guitar when the Ramones retired in 96. He said, I'll sell you. He wanted to get rid of his equipment, Johnny, his guitars, and he said, I'll sell it to Daniel. And Daniel bought it for like $20,000 last year. You know what that auction went for?
At least $1 million.
His original guitar they played, almost $1 million.
Oh my God!
So Daniel's doing good.
And Johnny bought his first Mosrite for $50, right?
Right. Yeah. And this one guitar he used basically most of his career. That's why it went for such a high price. He used it on most of the shows and a lot of the recordings. So it was an iconic guitar.
And he liked that style because it was pretty much what the Ventures used, right? I mean, it was like that early 60s style guitar.
Yeah, no, it had the neck he liked. Wasn't a smaller type of neck and stuff like that. And because the way he played with the bar chords and stuff and downstrokes, he liked the guitar very much.
I mean, because given the time period when the Ramones were getting together, rock music had gotten so, in some cases, almost too big with all the long guitar solos and everything like that, that you would think that finding a guitar like that would be near impossible. But it seems pretty correct for the time period also to have a lot of nostalgia for the 50s and the 60s. There's so many movies in that era that were coming out, like American Graffiti and Grease, that really held the 50s and the early 60s on this like high pedestal. And the way I always heard it, the Ramones, even though they have that buzzsaw sound, they're very much more song centric than guitar centric. Like,
Yeah, people don't realize there's melodies and songs behind the Ramones, not just three chords hacking away, you know.
Yeah.
And they grew up with listening to a lot of great music. I mean, Tom and I used to go to the Fillmore East here in New York. Was a fantastic venue. You know, it's Fillmore West, Fillmore East at the time.
Yeah.
Fillmore East here, and we saw so many bands, and they grew up listening to lots and lots of music. You know,
I never got to hear. I bet if I dug, I could probably find it. But Tangerine Puppets, what was their sound like? Was it very 60s, like jingly?
Yeah, they did a lot of cover songs that are, you know, early stuff, yes, or 60s and
like Tommy James and the Shondells kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, yeah, I get, you know, funny thing about it is, you know, I went to junior high school, Tommy, and I went to high school, Tommy, one day in the auditorium, was a talent show, and I'm up in the audience, and then they came on and played, and Tommy was playing guitar, and Johnny was playing bass for that group. There's a picture of that in my book there. But yeah, I saw them way back then. I can't really remember exactly what they were playing, but it was, you know, it was cover songs, basically, you know.
My high school band, you know, the band I formed in high school I formed it because of the Ramones. Basically, I learned how to play bass, listening to their music, and our guitarist was far more talented. He could play a lot of other stuff, but I almost intentionally held us back. And I think that our first couple of shows were all cover shows, and I would say about 60% of it was Ramones. Because I demanded it, and it was funny because I think the first song we ever performed live was "I Don't Want to Walk Around with You," which turns out that was the first song that they wrote, right?
It's one of the early songs. Yeah. So you're a bass player. I'm a bass player too.
Yeah, I was reading about it. You said you picked it up pretty quickly, right? Like you weren't even really that all into playing music, and then you just kind of picked it up.
Yeah. Well, you know, as I said, I went to junior high school and high school Tommy, and he was always into bands, and I was good friends with him. He said one day, you know, why don't you go buy a bass and try to learn it? I picked up really. The first group I was in was a group called Triad with Tommy. It's kind of like Cream or Jimi Hendrix 3-piece group, power trio. And then Tommy went on to doing recording studio. He worked as assistant engineer. He got into recording studios. He really wanted to engineer and produce groups, and initially that's what he wanted to do with the Ramones, is produce them and engineer them and manage them in the beginning. And then I got into another group called 30 Days Out, which I said before, I was had 2 albums on 71, 72. We toured with the Beach Boys, and then I got into another group after that with Tommy. After that group, like right at the end of glam rock period, group called Butch. If you look at the picture of me there, we're like glam rock with the satin pants and the suspenders and stuff. So I was in several groups with Tommy.
Would you say Tommy is? Oh, I just happened to open up to the page with Tommy's picture. Is he sort of the brainchild of the Ramones? Like they probably would not have existed without him.
Well, yeah. I mean, he brought the group into performance studios to manage them and produce them, basically. And then they couldn't find drummers because they didn't know that nobody could understand what the Ramones were doing in the beginning. You know, but Tom would sit down on the drums and try. He was a guitar player, but he was a great musician. He'd sit down and play along with these drummers to, you know, play along with the group like this. And no drummer's going to understand what they're doing. They were so raw in the beginning. So they asked him to join the group. So once he joined the group, you know, he wanted to kind of like manage them also. You know, he drew up a lot of the promo ads and stuff like that, and bios and stuff like that. He worked on and did a lot of early interviews and stuff. So he was like, I say he's the architect of the band, you know.
And it seems that, and because he left that position after a couple albums, but he seemed very humble. I mean, honestly, like that style of music, which, you know, dozens of bands try to replicate since the Ramones, if not just influenced by them. He doesn't get nearly as much credit as probably he deserves. And he seemed like a pretty humble guy.
Oh yeah. I mean, initially, as I said, he wanted to manage them and produce them, and they got into the group, and touring was just grinding for him. He just couldn't, you know, they were playing a lot of groups, shows over the years there that he was there, and he decided he just couldn't take touring anymore. But he said, and he's producing. He was working engineering with them, and then he stayed with them to produce a lot of great albums for the Ramones. Stuck around. And when he quit, he brought Marky into the band, worked with Marky and stuff like that. So he was always involved even after he left the band with the band.
Yeah, but he never. I remember seeing him at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, and he gave an incredible speech. He thanked everybody need to, but I don't know. It's just maybe because I was just so into the group, I knew about it, but a lot of people probably didn't realize even then just what a huge role he played. That in the famous logo, his name ought to be really at the top, as the leader almost.
True. Yeah. He really thanked a lot of people and thanked me during their speech, which was really nice and stuff. People don't realize he was really a great architect and influence the whole Ramones story.
Yeah, because in some ways, from reading your book, it almost seemed like Johnny, and to a certain extent Dee Dee, almost were reluctant to play in another group. Like Johnny didn't seem all that interested in picking up a guitar or anything. He was kind of after talked into it.
What do you mean? Initially with the Ramones, you're talking about?
Yeah, it said that he was kind of like, I don't know if I want to do that, and because he said he was like in construction or something at the time, and he wasn't.
Well, yeah, they just he was into, as I said, the Tangerine Puppets, so he's a bit into the music before the Ramones, basically. Yeah. But then he went into the construction, and Tommy, when they got together in Forest Hills in the basement of his mother's art gallery, and they started to put together the Ramones, Johnny started getting back into it and realized that there might be something there. And then when Tommy brought them into performance studios, they started to realize there could be something really good going on here.
Yeah, it must have been just amazing to be there on the first stages of that. So the next question on because a lot of these questions we've answered just from conversing, but I kind of have a two parts to this question. So the next one is, with any primary source, who's the intended audience or user of it? So first, with your book, who did you write the book for? Was it just the fans to get the inside scoop, or was it potentially to attract people who weren't totally familiar with the group at all?
Well, it was a cathartic experience for me to get everything out that I had inside. It was for basically, I wanted to tell the story also what it was like to be with the group, and also all the people behind the group, what it's like. People go to a show, they see the band on stage, they don't realize underneath the band is a foundation. There's a crew there.
Yeah.
There's other people that are really involved. So in my book, I talked about what the band was doing, also how the crew was involved and how I was involved with the crew and how that affected the band. You go see a band, people don't realize if it's a bad sound mixer, the band's going to sound bad.
Right.
A lousy light guy, the light's going to look bad. Or the guitar roadie's bad, the guitar's going to sound bad. So there's a lot of people underneath. There's a foundation I try to bring out in the book. Also, I put the writers in and the stage plots and that, and also working with the band, what it was like working with the band. So it was all that I try to put into my book.
And I really like the sections where you show like the stage setup and how many roadies would be needed, not only in the crew itself that would travel, but then at every single, you said it was always nice at a club when they had volunteers. College campuses seemed to be the best, right? Because they already had a group of enthusiastic, young people like, yeah, I'll help, and, unload and load up everything.
Yeah. Sure. Some clubs, I had trouble getting people to help the crew load in and out. Some of these clubs, there was up downstairs and was horrible, So colleges always had extra. It was always nice playing colleges and stuff like that.
Now, as far as
people don't realize that I had I had to deal with in my book. So I deal with a crazy band, but I also had to deal with a crazy crew too. So it's double the amount of nutty people around me. You know what I mean? So I'll try to throw that into the mix. You know what I mean?
So you were like just the kind of like the hub of everything, right? I mean, like,
that's the job of a road manager, tour managers, to bring everything together, and make sure everything works and all the people are working properly and behaving properly, which is chore at times.
When you were at like festivals and stuff with other big groups, did you get to commiserate with other tour managers about some of the same kind of issues?
I talked to them. I had some conversations with a bunch of people. Sure, you talk about it, and there's other books out there you can read about what's going on. But I try to bring that out in a book. A lot of people don't realize what a road manager or tour manager really does. So I try to bring that out in the book.
Yeah,
quite a bit.
And I think the book form, and there's other books about the Ramones too, but this one's by far my favorite because of the perspective that we get about the group from you. But it seems like every now and then the topic comes up of a Ramones biopic, that they want to make a movie about the Ramones. And I'm like, I always think to myself, I'm like, I don't know if you can do it. I really don't think anybody can replicate that for the screen in any real solid way. I mean, do you think there's any other reason why?
Have you seen The End of the Century, the documentary about that?
So the documentary I like because it's all that nice raw footage, but I don't know if they could ever do because I have, like, behind me, I have the poster for the Johnny Cash movie, Walk the Line. And that was pretty good. I like that. But every time I've watched either that or Ray or, they had Love and Mercy about the Beach Boys a couple years ago. I always think to myself, I'm like, I don't know, even just like that miniseries Pistol. I'm like, I just don't know if you could do the Ramones. Like I don't know if you could get an actor to wear a costume. I saw the CBGB movie.
That was bad, right?
And they had the Ramones in that, and I'm like, I don't think they showed up on the first day looking like the Ramones in 1989. Like they developed that look.
And the weird part about that is that the people that are managing the Ramones were having problems with each other, and I think one of them didn't like the way Johnny looked, so they wouldn't let them use the Ramones songs in the movie. Those are actually Joey Ramones songs in the movie.
They didn't play.
They sound like the Ramones, but people don't realize.
Yeah,
they wouldn't let them use the real Ramones songs. Just saying, they didn't do a good job of the way the Ramones looked and how they were portrayed. But there is, Mickey, Joey's brother, wrote the book "I Slept with Joey Ramone," which is an interesting story. And their Netflix is supposedly is doing something, and Pete Davidson's going to play Joey Ramone. So
we'll see.
I'm trying to be consultant on the movie, Ramones consultant, so make sure they got the right stuff on the movie. We'll see what happens with that.
Well, I know that they have legions of fans, myself included. I'm not nearly as gatekeeperish as some people are, but there's legions of Ramones fans that are so detail oriented that if they get any one little thing wrong, Joey wouldn't hold his mic like that, or he wouldn't. It's like they're not gonna the movie, whatever comes out is not gonna do well. And so I don't know if that's one of the reasons why nobody's touched the Ramones as a.
Well, it's also such a big, 20 something years. You got so many different aspects of the Ramones, and not just one thing, one group. Basically, it's a bunch of 5 different versions of the Ramones over the years. That's when I was doing the cover for my book. Most books have a photo of the band on the cover, but there's 5 different versions of the Ramones. I figured I didn't want 5 photos, so I got John Holmstrom to do the cover of my book, which is great. That's me in the van with all 8 Ramones, or 8 different Ramones over. If you look, lots of things going on. There's a Pinhead, and we're leaving CBGBs, and
I love his
flying off the top.
I've always loved his style of drawing.
Yeah,
I have a bunch of the back issues of the Punk, reprinted Punk magazine.
He's great. And as I said, we just got back from Germany with him. We did a convention together, and he was telling his stories, and I was telling my stories. Also, on the cover of my book, there's the sign 2,263 miles to go. That's how many shows they played, actually.
Oh, man.
And another good thing about my book is that the publisher let me put in a lot of images and photos and tour passes. So it's like 300 different images. Usually your book has like text, some pictures in the middle. They let me put in it's a very colorful book with tour passes, itineraries, photos, and the way that the art director put color into the book I was very happy with what they did.
No, like I said at the very beginning, it's exceptional, not only for the information, but just the layout alone. I love, and I'm pretty sure because I was rereading it the other day, in getting ready for this podcast, but back when I first got the book a couple years ago, I'm pretty sure I read it by the end of the day that I got it. It was just like, so like you go through their entire career, and then you have, like you said, like those great little compliments of the images to go along with it. So it's almost like, it's like listening to, well, it's like you say in the introduction, like just sitting around like a bar or something and listening to the stories, but also having the nice, it drove me crazy growing up, after 1996, you didn't get to see them. I was this close to seeing them at Lollapalooza. They were going to be, because I was in way upstate New York as a teenager, and they were going to be in Burlington, Vermont with Lollapalooza, and I was going to go, but then I wasn't able to get there. And it seemed like almost every single person that I've met since then, it's like, oh yeah, I saw the Ramones 5 times, right? I saw them here and there. I'm like, like I never got to see them once. So talking to you has kind of cleansed that. I'm like, well, maybe I didn't get to see the band in any of its versions or forms, but being able to talk to the person who's responsible for getting them to those shows that all the people that I've known that have seen him live got to see has just been incredible, to say the least. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. I'm pleasure.
Yeah. So I again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me about your book, about the greatest band of all time. I know you said they're the hardest working band you've ever known. Has anybody ever come close to competing with them as far as how hard they worked?
Well, I only work with them basically, and a couple other groups after that. But no, as I said, they worked hard at what they were doing. It wasn't just play 3 chords and that was it. They rehearsed a lot. They worked on their stage act a lot, and they thought about a lot of different things that really made the whole act work.
Yeah. I mean, and you said it so well before about just it's like when you watch a really good movie or TV show and you see that the credits at the end and you're like, all these people made it possible. And so it's really great that you put in your book, basically the credits for 22 years of touring of the Ramones that made that possible, because it wasn't just the 4 guys on stage. It was a whole litany of other people behind the scenes.
Yeah. I list all the crew in the book there too, and the people that were involved with the band and the agents and managers and all that. I all list them in the book,
Yeah. And so much of that didn't really even exist before the Ramones, as far as for that style of music and the kind of the band that they became, constantly touring like that. So, they really broke a lot of ground, it seemed, in that area too of, because like I said, I've been to plenty of shows and concerts and stuff. And I got to think that especially the smaller clubs and the smaller venues that have a lot of the punk acts and stuff like that, probably, and I think even the one closest to where I am at Hampton Beach Casino and Ballroom hosted the Ramones a few times.
Yeah, I remember that place.
And that's a great place to see a concert because it's very turn of the century. It was built 1899 and is designed as like a dance hall, but is a great venue because there's really not a bad seat.
Yeah, it's a good place.
It's right on the beach and the boardwalk and everything. It's very conducive to a rock and roll concert. So this has just been spectacular. So thank you again, Monte A Melnick, for joining the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source, including on the road with the Ramones and the Ramones themselves. So thank you again for joining the show.
And just remember, the book is out on Amazon.com in a bonus edition.
Oh, that's right. There's an extra 40 pages, you said.
Yeah, only on Amazon right now.
Only on Amazon. All right.
Bonus edition.
Make sure you check that out, everybody, and join us again next time for the EPS podcast.
Welcome to Season 2 of the EPS Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS Podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube, and especially on Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.